Curious about predicament bondage? Discover how this unique form of BDSM combines restraint, creativity, and psychology to create thrilling challenges where the submissive must choose between pain, pleasure, and surrender. I'm Brandon the Dom. Let's dive in. One of the reasons I enjoy BDSM is that it always brings an element of spice, variety, and uniqueness that you don't get with your everyday run-of-the-mill vanilla sex. Although I enjoy bondage, sometimes having my submissive completely restrained feels a little boring to me as a top. At times, I need to scratch my creative itch. Other times, I just want to make my submissive work for their pleasure. And occasionally, I'm feeling a bit sadistic and I want to play with my submissive like a cat plays with its prey, teasing, toying them, and pushing until they surrender. Welcome to the world of predicament bondage, where the submissive is at the mercy of your creative designs and left with a difficult choice between a rock and a hard place. But not all predicaments need to be painful. Not all of them require elaborate torture machines or obstacle courses to become deeply frustrating for the sub. This video is going to help you understand predicament bondage and how to design predicaments, no matter what type of dominant you are. So what is predicament bondage? Predicament bondage is a form of restraint in which a partner's mobility is limited or controlled intentionally by creating situations called a predicament where the submissive must make difficult choices between conflicting desires, consequences, or sensations. The challenge lies in how the submissive navigates the situation their dominant has engineered using skill, intelligence, physical strength, and endurance to achieve the desired outcomes or avoid unwanted consequences. Now, many predicaments involve choosing between the lesser of two evils, such as enduring pain or discomfort no matter the option. That's only one strategy. A predicament could also easily be a choice between two pleasures, making the dynamic just as intriguing. Now, why do people enjoy predicament bondage? Because predicament bondage is a subset of bondage. Many of the same desires, motivations, and psychology are at play. But predicaments also offer a unique kind of satisfaction, one that's very similar to playing a game or solving a puzzle. It's almost as if the dom gets the satisfaction of creating the puzzle, while the sub gets to be fully immersed in solving it. So this experience often includes challenge and engagement. The submissive is trapped in a bind where every option has trade-offs. Holding one position hurts, shifting hurts differently. Their body and mind are equally hooked into the challenge, which leads to focused attention. The submissive becomes hyper-focused on the immediate puzzle of their body, how to endure, adjust, or balance. That presence pulls them out of intrusive thoughts and anxieties, anchoring them in the moment. Of course, they also get problem-solving satisfaction through their micro-adjustments, breathing techniques, or mental reframing. The submissive is earning little victories that deliver dopamine hits and make the struggle both manageable and satisfying. There's also creativity in play, so the dominant gets to flex their wit, intelligence, and imagination, crafting solutions that are elegant, balanced, and can be devilishly fun. It's basically artistry through constraint. There's also tension and release. So the strain of something that seems impossible to do builds a lot of tension, making any shift, whether relief or escalation, feel amplified. And then, of course, achievement. So there may be a moment where the submissive experience an aha moment, which is going to trigger a rush of dopamine and a sense of competence when they discover how to endure, or when the dominant acknowledges that they're struggling. And depending on whether you're playing with a pleasure dom or one leading more towards sadism, the predicament can create unique associations with pleasure, pain, and emotion. Ultimately, the possibilities are limited by the dom's creativity and the limitations of what the submissive can endure. So now let's talk about how to design predicament bondage. Since part of the satisfaction of predicament bondage comes from creating the scenario, I'm going to refrain from giving you a list of pre-made setups. Instead, I'm going to focus on the building blocks of design. Think of it like teaching you how to cook rather than handing you a pre-made meal. This approach is ideal because it allows you to craft scenarios that fit the specific limitations of your submissive while tapping into the motivations and desires of both of you as players. First, let's start with risk management and safety. At the core of predicament bondage are two elements: the predicament, the decision that the submissive must make, and the bondage, the restraint itself. How these two are implemented can widely vary, which makes it impossible to cover every risk that may be associated with it. Instead, let's look at some risk management strategies that apply across most situations. First, start simple. Predicament bondage does not need to be extreme. It can be as simple as mental bondage. in which the submissive is told to stand in one spot for a period of time, with any movement earning them a smack from a riding crop. In this case, the restraint isn't physical, but psychological. The fear of punishment holds them in place. As long as you stick to mental bondage, harmless positions, and reasonable time limits, your play is unlikely to become unsafe. However, the more complexity you introduce, or the more physical bondage that you add, the greater the risk. For example, rope bondage carries risks like nerve damage and restricted circulation. Certain positions may involve choking or breath control, which can be dangerous if sustained for too long. And heavy bondage, such as suspension or device play, can cause serious injuries if done incorrectly, including damage to soft tissue, muscles, or bone. The second thing to consider is understanding your submissive's limitations. Because predicament bondage often places submissives in strenuous situations, both physically and mentally, you need to consider the limitations for both of those. Physically, you should consider what positions they realistically can maintain. Difficult enough to challenge them, but not so hard that they basically fail immediately. Can they hold the position or keep their balance safely? Since some predicaments involve stress, fear, or heightened pleasure, can their body handle that strain? Muscle stress, elevated heart rate, sweating, trembling, without creating excessive risk to them. Mentally, you want to consider how they will respond to the possibility of failing you. If they're highly anxious or sensitive to judgment, predicament bondage might feel more like punishing than playful. Remember, you're designing a puzzle. For puzzles to be engaging instead of overwhelming, they need to fall within your submissive's zone of proximal development, the sweet spot between what they can already do and what's beyond their reach even with support. And finally, be mindful of your submissive's hard and soft limits. If wax is a hard limit, then it has no place within your design. One useful tool for determining these is a sex menu, which gives you a reference point for brainstorming possible elements you can add to your predicaments. I'll leave a link down below to 350 different sex and kink hacks that you can find hard and soft limits for using a sex menu. All right, the last thing I want to talk about in risk and safety is considering the worst case scenario. So for every element you plan to use, think through how this could go wrong. Don't let your desires blind you. Plan for the risks. For example, if a submissive is balancing on their toes with nipple rings tied overhead, what happens if they lose their balance? In that case, the nipple rings might get torn out, which you probably don't want. So by anticipating worst case scenarios, you can prepare emergency procedures and have the right tools and equipment at hand. These might be things like EMT shears to cut rope, keys for locks, bolt cutters for chains. You might also need an inhaler, an emergency kit, EpiPen, things for blood sugar. I also recommend having your phone somewhere nearby that's charged and easily used if you need to make an emergency call. If you're dealing with fire, having a fire extinguisher or a fire blanket. And if you're having somebody balance, suspending, think about soft flooring or a crash pad for them to land on. And if you engage in predicament bondage with any sort of frequency or intensity, it's not a matter if something's going to go wrong, it's a matter of when. So be prepared for these things. Next thing to consider in designing your predicament bondage is motivations. So when designing scenarios, it's both important to understand your intentions for the scene and what motivates your submissive to make a choice within the predicament. As the dominant, your goal may be disciplining through punishment, something that predicament bondage is quite excellent for, creating a challenge for your submissive to overcome that boosts their confidence and self-worth, or pushing them fully to surrender to your power. In scenarios where the submissive could solve the dilemma and possibly free themselves, they're going to experience a strong sense of accomplishment, which can feel very empowering and uplifting. In scenarios where the submissive cannot escape, but must endure until release, they may feel frustration, helplessness, vulnerability, and eventually surrender. So for the submissive, depending on what elements are at play, is going to help determine their motivations. Most often a choice between pain and pleasure. So common motivations include relieving fatigue, achieving a personal goal, pleasing the dominant, gaining pleasure, avoiding pain, seeking comfort, obeying an order, avoiding punishment, receiving praise or some other type of reward, avoiding humiliation or embarrassment. As with any scene, knowing your goal and intention is crucial. without a clear purpose, a predicament scenario can feel flat and directionless. All right, now let's talk about strategies. In simple predicament bondage, the submissive is basically choosing between two opposing forces. More complex scenarios may involve multiple motivations or layered challenges where the puzzle leads to one another. But to start, there are three basic strategies: a pain-pain strategy, a pain-pleasure strategy, and a pleasure-pleasure strategy. So the pain-pain strategy is basically the lesser of two evils, where the submissive is choosing between two types of discomfort, the rock and the hard place. So for example, a submissive's toes are tied to their nipples. As long as they hold their legs up, their nipples avoid strain. But eventually those legs are going to fatigue, forcing a choice between that leg pain as they're fatiguing or the nipple pain as it gets pulled down and their legs are lowered. Now, not all pain has to be physical. For instance, the submissive could be ordered to hold a coin up against the wall or risk disappointing you. The next strategy is the pain-pleasure strategy, so consequences and rewards. In this scenario, the submissive must endure pain or discomfort in order to access pleasure, whether that's praise, reward, or sexual stimulation. So for example, I once chained a submissive to the bed and sat just far enough so that when she went towards me, she would be barely out of reach. And I ordered her to come suck my cock. As she strained against the chains, her arms would basically pull back painfully. So the more she tried to come over, the more it would pull on her. Her desire to please and to have me in her mouth drove her to push through the discomfort. And spoiler, she stretched those arms like a champ. Another example, returning to the coin on the wall, you could intensify that scene by holding a vibrator against their clit. If the coin drops, then the consequences might be a caning. The third strategy is the pleasure-pleasure strategy. Here, the submissive is choosing between two pleasurable sensations, but they cannot have them at the same time. So for example, placing a magic wand or dildo behind your submissive while offering your cock in front of them. Here, they must decide between which pleasure to prioritize. And for a submissive that had an oral fixation or a very strong desire to please, this creates quite the predicament. Here's some other examples of predicament bondage to inspire your own designs. So you might be testing flexibility or strength, such as tying something to an overhead point so the submissive must remain on their toes. You might be forcing stillness, such as balancing a cup of water on each hand, and spilling the water earns consequences. You might have them choosing between discomforts, so placing the submissive in one distressing position that can only be relieved by moving into another equally uncomfortable position. You might be testing obedience and focus, so put a paddle between their teeth as a gag. If they drop it, they get 20 hard strokes. Meanwhile, you could be stimulating them with a magic wand or other pleasure tool. You might also work with embarrassment or humiliation. So they might be able to free themselves from the predicament, but at the cost of something embarrassing. For example, to reach the keys, they must move in a way that opens up the curtains. So imagine that you had them tied to the curtains and they would open up if they moved forward. Of course, you don't actually have to expose them to anything. You could have them blindfolded. They don't know that it's dark outside or that the shades are down, and when they open the blindfold, it's not really going to do anything. Which also leads to you could be creating mind fucks, basically using psychological tricks like that. For example, you might freeze a dull butter knife so the edge feels like it's more sharp against the skin, but isn't really going to cut them. Now, I want to give a few tips for the submissives that are going to be in these predicaments. As a submissive in predicament bondage, it's important to identify the purpose of the scene and your own motivations. Doing so is going to help you overcome the challenge that your dom has set forth, or surrender more fully to your fate. And the goal of this play is mutual fun. So while you should give your best effort, predicament should not be designed to make you feel like a failure. If the scene stops being enjoyable, it may be time to change elements or stop altogether. And remember, no matter how intense the challenge, you always have your safe words. On a practical note, stretch beforehand if you're going to be placed in physically demanding positions. Also, let your dom know about any mental or physical conditions that could make the predicament more difficult or dangerous for you. So that's the world of predicament bondage. It isn't just about restraints, it's about creativity, psychology, and the thrill of choices that are not easy to make. So whether you're crafting a scene to challenge, punish, tease, or delight, the real magic lies in designing something unique to you and your submissive. So remember the essentials. Start simple, play within your partner's limits, keep safety front and center, and know your intentions. From there, the possibilities are endless, limited by only your imagination and the dynamic you share. At best, predicament bondage is going to feel like a game. Sometimes frustrating, sometimes exhilarating, but always very immersive. So experiment, laugh at the missteps, savor the struggle, and enjoy the victories. Now, if you're curious about other types of bondage, I recommend watching this video on bondage for beginners, which doesn't require you learning a ton of ties and shibari. So check out that video. Thank you so much for your time and attention.